The moment he said it, the air in the hall changed. "I want to thank my beautiful wife," Victor began, lifting his glass high enough for the chandeliers to catch the gold of his cufflinks. 250 faces turned toward him, smiling, waiting for charm. And of course, a special thank you to my new mother-in-law, the woman who proved money can't fix being an ugly loser. For a second, nobody moved. Then a few laughs slipped out. Not loud at first, just nervous bursts from his side of the room. A couple of his relatives clapped like they thought it was bold humor. Someone at the back choked on a drink. The band stopped playing mid-note. I didn't blink. The insult landed softly, almost gently, like something wrapped in silk. That was the strange part. I had imagined anger would feel loud, a thunderclap, a crack in the chest. Instead, it felt quiet, cold, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I sat perfectly still at the head table, hands folded on my lap, the way my daughter taught me when she was little and insisted I look regal at her school events. My dress shimmered under the lights. The cake stood behind Victor like a crown no one deserved yet. He smiled wider when he noticed the laughter growing. "I mean it," he added, tapping his glass with a fork. "Some people buy respect. Some people think writing checks makes them important." His eyes found mine. There was something sharp in them. Not nerves, not drunkenness. It was relief, like he had waited months to say those words out loud. I heard a woman at the table beside me whisper, "Did he just—" and then stop herself. Alara's hand tightened around her champagne flute, and I felt the shift before I saw it. My daughter had always worn her emotions honestly. Joy first, anger second, tears last. But now she sat very still, watching him the way someone watches a stranger cross a line they can't step back from. I kept my face calm, not because it didn't hurt, but because reacting in a room like that would turn the moment into spectacle. And I had not spent years building myself into a woman people respected just to lose control in front of guests who would forget my dignity long before they forgot his words. Victor continued talking. Something about success, something about earning things yourself. His family laughed louder this time, encouraged by his confidence. One of his uncles lifted a glass toward him like this was entertainment. I noticed the photographers hesitate. Their cameras hovered in the air, unsure whether to capture smiles or silence. My mind wandered briefly, not away from the insult, but through it. I remembered the late nights when Alara was younger, when I worked through exhaustion to keep our life stable. I remembered the first time Victor came to dinner, the way he watched my home like he was measuring it. I remembered the messages I once sent my daughter, gentle warnings she said came from fear, not wisdom. And now, here we were. He lowered his glass, satisfied, waiting for applause. None came. The room hung between discomfort and curiosity, guests glancing toward me to see if I would speak. I didn't. I reached for my water instead, took a small sip, and set the glass down carefully so it wouldn't shake. That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. Victor tilted his head slightly, almost daring me to react. What?" he said lightly into the microphone. "No comeback? I thought you'd have one ready." A few more laughs, thinner now, uncertain. Across the table, Alara's breathing changed. I heard it before anyone else did. Slow at first, then deeper, like someone preparing to stand up after sitting too long. Her chair scraped against the floor. Every eye in the room shifted. I turned my head slowly toward her, my heartbeat steady despite the tension pulling tight across the hall. She didn't look at me right away. Her gaze stayed fixed on Victor, on the man she had chosen, on the man who had just turned our celebration into something heavy and irreversible. She rose from her seat. The ring on her finger caught the light as she lifted her hand, and the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning above us. And Victor's smile faltered. "Alara?" he said, half laughing, unsure whether this was part of the moment he thought he controlled. My daughter took one step forward, and then she spoke. "Ilara," Victor repeated, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Relax, sweetheart. It's just a joke." The word sweetheart sounded thin, stretched across a room that had already decided something was wrong. My daughter didn't smile back. She moved closer to the center of the room, heels steady against the polished floor, her posture calm in a way I recognized. That was the posture she wore when she had made a decision she couldn't be talked out of. The guests leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing laughter. Even the band members stood frozen behind their instruments. Victor lifted the microphone again, trying to regain control. "Everyone's too serious tonight," he said, glancing toward his family for support. A few of them chuckled weakly. Ilara reached for his hand. For a moment he seemed relieved, as if he thought she was about to soften the tension, maybe kiss him, maybe turn the moment back into romance. His shoulders relaxed. Then she slid the ring off her finger. The motion was slow, deliberate. The diamond caught the chandelier light as she held it between two fingers. A hush fell across the hall so deep I could hear a glass clink somewhere near the back. She set the ring down on the table between them. The sound it made was small, just a quiet tap against polished wood. But it echoed louder than anything Victor had said. "Maybe," she said, her voice steady, "you're the biggest loser in this room." A collective breath rippled through the guests, and someone gasped. One of Victor's cousins muttered something under his breath, but nobody laughed this time. Victor blinked, stunned, his smile tightening into something brittle. "Okay. All right," he said, lifting his hands as if this were playful drama. "You're proving my point, Ilara. Your mom's always been dramatic, and now—" "Stop," she cut in. The word wasn't loud, but it carried weight. I watched her carefully, feeling a mixture of pride and worry twist together inside me. This wasn't the impulsive daughter who argued with me months ago when I warned her to be careful. This was someone who had reached a breaking point quietly, without announcing it to the world. She turned toward me then. Her eyes softened just enough for me to see the little girl she used to be, the one who held my hand tightly when crossing busy streets. The one who trusted me to lead when things felt uncertain. She reached out. I didn't hesitate. My fingers closed around hers, warm and trembling at the same time. Gasps traveled through the room as we stood together. Cameras lifted again, capturing the moment guests would replay for years. The bride leaving her own reception with her mother. Victor tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Ilara," he called after us, forcing confidence into his voice. "Don't make a scene. People are watching." "Yes," she said over her shoulder, calm and clear. "They finally are." We walked past rows of tables where conversations had died mid-sentence. Some guests looked ashamed. Others avoided eye contact entirely. A few of my friends nodded subtly as we passed, silent gestures of support that steadied my steps. The doors to the hall opened, or when cool evening air rushed in, washing away the heavy perfume and tension behind us. Outside, the noise of the reception faded into a distant murmur. Ilara's hand slipped from mine. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped. Her shoulders rose sharply with a breath she couldn't hold in anymore. The strength she had carried inside the hall cracked open all at once. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't collapse immediately. She pressed her palms against her face, shaking her head like she was trying to push away something she had hidden for too long. "I thought," she began, then stopped. I stayed quiet, giving her space. Silence had always been my way of letting her speak honestly, without feeling judged. She turned toward me finally, her voice breaking. "It wasn't perfect before today," she admitted. It hasn't been for a while." The words hung between us, heavier than anything Victor had said. In the distance, faint laughter drifted from inside the hall, forced, awkward sounds as guests tried to recover from what they had just witnessed. Alara wiped her cheeks quickly, as if embarrassed by the tears. "I kept telling myself he was just stressed," she said, "that once the wedding was over, once everything settled, he'd change." My chest tightened, but I didn't interrupt. She looked back toward the doors we had just walked through, her expression caught between relief and fear. "There's more," she whispered, her voice barely steady. And in that moment, I realized the wedding wasn't the worst thing that had happened to my daughter. It was only the first thing I was finally allowed to see, and the parking lot lights flickered softly above us, casting long shadows across the pavement. Alara leaned against the side of my car, arms folded tight across her chest, trying to steady herself. I didn't rush her. Some truths needed space before they could breathe. I had seen pieces of this moment long before the wedding day, not the insult, not the public humiliation, but the slow unease that followed Victor everywhere he went. The first time Alara brought him home, he walked through my living room like he was measuring it, not admiring, not appreciating, just calculating. He complimented the artwork, but his tone carried a question underneath it, like he was trying to figure out how much everything cost rather than what it meant. "Nice place," he said back then, running a hand along the back of one of my chairs. "All must be good having someone set you up like this." I smiled politely and corrected him. "I built this myself." He nodded, but the look in his eyes didn't change. It was subtle, a quick flicker of disbelief that told me he had already decided who I was before I finished my sentence. After that night, I began sending Alara small messages. Nothing harsh, just quiet reminders. Make sure he respects you. Watch how he speaks when he thinks no one important is listening. Love should never feel like you're proving your worth. She told me I worried too much. Standing in the parking lot now, watching her fight back tears, I remembered every conversation we had where she defended him. Every time she said I was being too cautious, too protective. No, and I remembered how carefully Victor responded to me in public. Always polite enough to avoid conflict, but never warm enough to build trust. "What did you see back then?" Alara asked suddenly, her voice softer now. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "You always said you weren't sure about him, but you never told me everything." I exhaled slowly. "It wasn't one big thing," I said. "It was the small things he thought no one noticed." She turned toward me slightly, waiting. "He never asked how I built my company," I continued. "He only asked how long my husband had been gone and whether I inherited the business after." Her jaw tightened. "I told him more than once that I started from nothing," I said. He would nod, then change the subject, like the truth didn't fit the story he wanted. Alara closed her eyes briefly, processing. Victor's business came to mind next, the way he spoke about it with pride, but avoided details when conversations turned practical. I had done my quiet research months earlier, not to interfere, but to understand the man my daughter was choosing. Missed payments, loans extended beyond reason, partnerships that ended abruptly. Nothing illegal, just a pattern of pressure. "He always looked at me like I was the finish line," I admitted quietly, "not just as your mother, but as someone whose approval meant he had finally won something." Alara swallowed hard. "He said you never believed in him." "I believed in you," I corrected gently. The wind moved through the empty spaces between parked cars, carrying faint music from the reception hall. Inside, the celebration we planned was still continuing without us, pretending nothing had cracked. "I didn't want to control your life," I added. "That's why I never pushed harder." She nodded slowly, guilt flickering across her face. "What about his business?" she asked after a moment. "You always avoided talking about it." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It wasn't stable," I said. "Not in the way he made it sound. I thought the wedding stress might be making things worse for him, but I never expected tonight." Alara stared down at her empty hand where the ring used to sit. The absence of it seemed louder than anything we said. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now, less fragile, more honest. "There's something else," I said finally. She looked up. "I didn't tell anyone," I continued, my voice steady. "Not even you." Her brow furrowed slightly. "After the reception," I said, "I planned to give Victor a gift, a private one." She blinked, confused. "What kind of gift?" I held her gaze, knowing the weight of what I was about to reveal would change how she saw everything that happened inside that hall. "I arranged a $2 million investment for his company," I said quietly. "Tonight was supposed to be the night I handed him the biggest chance of his life." Alara froze, and for the first time since we walked out of the reception, the silence between us felt heavier than the insult he threw across that room. The inside of my car felt quieter than any room I had ever sat in. Alara rested her head back against the seat, eyes closed, breathing uneven but calmer than before. The glow from the reception hall spilled through the windshield, soft gold against the dark, like a celebration that no longer belonged to us. $2 million. The number floated between us, heavier than the silence. I didn't say anything else about it. I didn't explain how long I had planned it or how carefully I had structured the investment so Victor would feel respected rather than rescued. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was what came next. And I had already made the decision before we even reached the parking lot. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. No hesitation, no anger, just clarity. The contact I needed sat at the top of my messages. The financial officer who had been waiting for my confirmation all evening. The transfer wasn't public. It was scheduled to finalize at midnight once I gave the last approval. My thumb hovered over the screen for only a second. Then I typed, "Cancel the release. Redirect the funds to the alternate account. Effective immediately." I pressed send. The message disappeared into the quiet night, and with it, every plan I had made for Victor's future. Alara opened her eyes slowly. "You really canceled it?" "Yes," I said simply. She stared at me, searching my face for anger or disappointment, but I felt neither. What I felt was stillness, the kind that comes when a difficult truth settles into place. "Aren't you upset?" she asked. "I'm clear," I replied. That seemed to surprise her more than anything else. I leaned back against my seat and watched a group of guests step outside the venue, whispering to each other, phones already in their hands. The story of what happened inside was spreading, reshaping itself with every retelling. But I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to explain my decision to anyone. Dignity doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly. "I wasn't giving him money because he deserved it," I said after a moment. "I was doing it because I believed in your future. Tonight showed me something important. Support should never come at the cost of self-respect." Alara nodded slowly, absorbing that. "What will you do with it now?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't fully know yet. The funds had been redirected to a holding account, a space where decisions could breathe before becoming permanent. For the first time all evening, I felt a small sense of relief. Not because something had been taken away from Victor, but because I had taken something back for myself. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from the building behind us, forced and uneven. The Victor's voice rose above it briefly, loud enough to sound confident but thin enough to betray the crack underneath. I imagined him trying to recover the moment, trying to convince everyone that nothing serious had happened. He had no idea what he had just lost. Alara's phone buzzed softly in her lap. She glanced at it, then set it aside without reading. "I don't want to talk to anyone right now," she said. "You don't have to," I replied. For a few seconds, we sat in silence again. Not the heavy silence from earlier. Something quieter, steadier. Then my own phone rang. The name on the screen made my chest tighten. Mary's, I answered immediately. Hello? Her voice came through, low and urgent. Tonya, I know this isn't a good time, but I couldn't wait. I glanced at Alara, who sat up slightly when she heard her friend's name. What is it? I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Not uncertainty, but wait. The kind of pause someone takes before opening a door they've been holding shut for too long. There's something you need to see, Maris said quietly. Something Alara didn't want you to know before today. My grip tightened around the phone. What kind of something? I asked. I have photos, she said, and messages from months ago. I kept them because she asked me to. But after what happened tonight, I can't stay silent anymore. The air inside the car shifted. Alara looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. Maris's voice softened, almost apologetic. I'm sending them to you now. Please, just look. A notification appeared on my screen. And in that moment, when I realized canceling the $2 million had only been the beginning of a truth I wasn't prepared to face, the first image loaded slowly. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that the dim light inside the car was distorting shapes, turning shadows into something heavier than they were. But as the screen brightened, the truth settled into focus. Alara's face stared back at me, not smiling, not posing, just tired. One side of her cheek slightly swollen, makeup carefully placed to hide what couldn't be erased completely. The date stamp in the corner told me it wasn't recent. Months ago. My breath caught, but I didn't make a sound. Another notification appeared, then another. Maris wasn't sending one picture. She was sending a history I had never been allowed to see. What is it? Alara asked softly, leaning toward me. I hesitated. My instinct as a mother was to shield her, to protect her from the shame she clearly carried. But shielding had already cost us too much silence. It's from Maris, I said carefully. She said there were things I needed to know. The second photo opened. Alara sitting on the edge of a bed, eyes red from crying, a faint mark near her temple. Nothing graphic, nothing loud, just enough to make the room inside my chest feel smaller. My hand stayed steady, but my heart didn't. A voice note followed. I pressed play. Victor's voice filled the car, not yelling, not raging, but sharp and cold, the way people sound when they believe control is more powerful than kindness. You think your mom's better than me? He said in the recording. You keep running back to her like she owns you. The audio ended abruptly, and Alara turned her face away, shame flickering across her expression. I didn't want you to hear that, she whispered. I placed my hand gently over hers. You don't have to explain anything right now. More messages appeared, screenshots of conversations between Alara and Maris, words that felt heavy without needing to be dramatic. He said it was my fault. I told him I'd stop arguing. Please don't tell my mom. She already doesn't like him. Each line felt like a door, closing quietly in a house I thought I knew completely. How long? I asked softly. Alara swallowed hard. Not all the time, she said quickly. Just when he got angry. He always apologized after. He said the stress from his business was getting to him. Her voice carried the familiar tone of someone trying to make something smaller than it really was. I scrolled further, my chest tightening as a final image appeared. Alara standing in a mirror, eyes distant, holding her phone slightly away from her face like she wasn't sure she wanted to look at herself. A faint bruise near her collarbone, partially hidden by fabric. It wasn't graphic. It didn't need to be. The proof was there. My mind returned to the reception hall, to Victor standing with a microphone, smiling as he called me an ugly loser in front of hundreds of people. Until this moment, I thought it was arrogance, ego, a desperate attempt to feel powerful. But now something colder slid into place. It wasn't random, it was control. He hadn't insulted me just to embarrass me. He did it to isolate Alara, to show her that even her own mother could be reduced to nothing in front of a crowd. A public performance meant to shift loyalty, to remind her where he believed her allegiance should live. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that realization settle without turning into anger. Anger would make this about me. And this was not about me. This was about my daughter finally stepping out of something she had carried alone. I told Maris not to send anything, Alara said quietly. I didn't want you to worry. I thought if I just handled it, it would get better. I turned toward her fully. You were trying to protect me, I said. She nodded, tears gathering again. And you were protecting him, I added gently, not as accusation but as truth. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of that realization pressing down. The screen of my phone dimmed, the last image fading into black. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wedding insult replayed in my mind. The way Victor's eyes searched for my reaction, the way he waited for Alara to choose sides. I understood now why his words carried that particular cruelty. He needed to weaken the one person he believed stood between him and complete control. I opened my eyes and looked at my daughter. This wasn't just a speech, I said quietly. It was a message. She looked at me, confused. A message that you were supposed to accept, I continued, that he could humiliate me and you would stay. Alara's breath caught, and in that moment I realized the wedding wasn't the breaking point for Victor. It was the moment his control finally slipped, and he didn't know yet how much evidence had just stepped into the light. The car stayed parked long after the music from the reception faded into the distance. Mona Lara stared down at her hands, turning her empty ring finger slowly like she was still trying to understand what she had just done. The glow from the dashboard lights softened the lines of her face, making her look younger than she had inside that hall. Less like a bride, more like the girl who used to sit beside me during long drives, asking questions she wasn't ready to hear answers to. I didn't rush into words. Blame would have been easy. Questions filled with why would have been louder than anything Victor said tonight. But I knew my daughter well enough to understand that shame already lived in the spaces she wasn't speaking from. Adding pressure would only push her back into silence. I'm not angry with you, I said finally. Her shoulders dropped slightly, relief and disbelief mixing together. You should be, she whispered. Yeah, you warned me so many times. I warned you because I love you, I replied gently, not because I needed to be right. She exhaled slowly, eyes glistening. I thought if I stayed long enough he would calm down, that the wedding would make him feel secure, like he wouldn't need to prove anything anymore. Her voice trembled at the edges, but she didn't look away this time. I kept thinking marriage would fix him, she admitted, that once we had something official, something stable, he'd stop feeling threatened by you, by everything. The honesty in her words hurt more than any accusation could have, not because she had been wrong, but because she had carried that belief alone for so long. People don't change because a ring appears, I said quietly. They change when they decide to face themselves. She nodded, tears slipping down without resistance now. I didn't want to see the parts that didn't make sense, she said. Every time he apologized, I told myself it meant he cared enough to try. I reached over and held her hand, not to interrupt, just to remind her she wasn't speaking into emptiness. He wasn't always like this, she added quickly, as if defending a memory she wasn't ready to let go of. At the beginning, he made me feel strong, like he believed in me more than anyone. That's often how it starts, I said softly. The night air pressed gently against the windows. Somewhere behind us, a car door slammed and laughter rose briefly, then faded again. Life was moving forward outside while we sat suspended between the past and whatever came next. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to disappoint you," Alara whispered. "You've always looked at me like I make smart decisions. I didn't want you to see me staying when I shouldn't have." I squeezed her hand. "Strength isn't never falling," I said. "It's recognizing when you deserve to stand somewhere safer." She let out a shaky breath, the tension in her body easing just a little. My phone vibrated softly in the cup holder. A new message from Maris. "Please don't wait too long. This isn't just personal anymore." I read it twice before responding. "What do you mean?" The reply came quickly. "Someone needs to review what I sent. A professional. I already spoke to an officer who handles situations like this. They said there are options, but only if Alara is willing." I hesitated, glancing at my daughter. The last thing I wanted was to push her into something she wasn't ready for. Tonight had already taken too much from her. "What is it?" she asked quietly, noticing my expression. "It's Mary's," I said. "She thinks we should talk to someone." "Officially." Alara stiffened slightly. "The police?" "Just a conversation," I answered. "Nothing forced." She stared out the window for a long moment, processing. Fear flickered across her face. Not just fear of Victor, but fear of what speaking out might change forever. "I don't want drama," she said softly. "This isn't about drama," I replied. "It's about protection." Silence settled between us again, heavier than before. I could see the battle inside her, the part that wanted to move on quietly and the part that was tired of carrying everything alone. Finally, she nodded once. Small, careful. "Okay," she said. We can talk to someone." I typed a short message back to Maris. "We're ready to listen." Almost immediately, she replied, "An officer is available tonight if you want. They said to come somewhere safe and private. No pressure, just information." I set the phone down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment shift again. This was the line where the story stopped being only ours. Alara looked at me, uncertainty in her eyes. "Does this mean everything changes now?" I held her gaze, steady and calm. "Yes," I said gently. "Tonight is the night the story changes." The room we sat in didn't feel like the version of authority people imagine from television. No bright lights, no harsh questions, just a quiet office with neutral walls and a small table between us. The officer listened more than they spoke, hands folded loosely, his voice calm enough that Alara's shoulders slowly stopped tensing with every sentence she shared. I sat beside her, resisting the urge to answer for her, to fill the spaces when she hesitated. This had to be her voice, not mine. "Start wherever feels easiest," the officer said gently. Alara nodded, eyes focused on a fixed point on the table. "It didn't begin loud," she said. "At first, it was small arguments. He would get angry when I talked about my mom, about work, about anything that made him feel smaller." Her words came slowly, but once they started, they didn't stop. She explained how Victor's frustration grew alongside the pressure on his business, how apologies followed every moment that crossed a line, how promises of change kept resetting her hope. The officer didn't interrupt, and they only asked quiet questions that helped shape the timeline. When the first incident happened, how often things escalated, whether anyone else had witnessed the tension. Maris sat across from us, hands wrapped tightly around her phone, occasionally confirming details when Alara faltered. The photos she had sent earlier now rested in a printed folder on the table. No longer just private memories, but pieces of something official. As the story unfolded, a pattern began to form. Not one dramatic event, but a steady climb from sharp words to raised voices, from raised voices to moments Alara couldn't explain away anymore. Listening to it laid out that way made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach across the table and pull her into my arms. I wanted to tell the officer we didn't need this, that we could handle everything quietly at home. That instinct to protect her from the weight of procedure pressed hard against me, but silence had already done enough damage. "What happens now?" I asked softly when there was a pause. The officer's response was careful, grounded in reality. "Nothing happens without her choice," they said, nodding toward Alara. "Our role right now is to understand the pattern and explain options. Documentation matters. It helps build protection if she needs it later." Protection. The word settled into the room like a new foundation. Alara shifted slightly in her chair. "I don't want this to turn into revenge," she said quietly. "It doesn't have to," the officer replied. "Accountability and safety are different from revenge." I watched my daughter absorb that, her breathing steady but thoughtful. And she wasn't running from the truth anymore. She was learning how to hold it without feeling ashamed. The officer reviewed the timeline once more, pointing gently to moments where escalation became clear. "The wedding incident," they added, "combined with what's documented here, suggests a pattern of control. Public humiliation can be part of that." Hearing someone else say it aloud made the night feel sharper. The insult wasn't just cruelty, it had been strategy. My phone vibrated softly on the table. I ignored it at first, not wanting to break Alara's focus, but when it buzzed again, and again, I glanced down. Victor. 3 messages. The first read, "Where are you? People are asking questions." The second, "You embarrassed me tonight. We need to talk before you make things worse." The third appeared as I watched. "And if you think walking out makes you strong, you don't know how this ends." A cold line ran through me. Not fear exactly, recognition. I turned the phone face down, trying to keep my expression calm, but Alara noticed the shift in my posture. "Is it him?" she asked quietly. I hesitated for only a second before nodding. Her shoulders stiffened. The officer's eyes moved briefly toward the phone. "If messages feel threatening," they said gently, "it's important to keep them. Don't respond right away. Documentation helps." Another vibration, another message lighting the screen. This time the words were shorter. "You can't hide behind her forever." I exhaled slowly, realizing that what had begun as a private humiliation had now turned into something more visible, more urgent. Alara reached for my hand under the table, and her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. And as the phone buzzed again, louder in the quiet room than any raised voice, I understood that Victor wasn't trying to repair what happened at the wedding. He was trying to regain control, one message at a time. The night felt longer than it should have. By the time we left the station, the air outside had cooled, carrying that quiet stillness that comes after too many emotions settle into one place. Alara walked beside me without speaking, her thoughts clearly somewhere far away. I didn't push conversation. Tonight had already taken enough from her. My phone buzzed again, not Victor this time, but a follow-up message from the officer we had just spoken to. "We'll begin reviewing the background information connected to his business." Patterns outside the relationship sometimes help explain behavior. I read the message twice. Victor had always spoken about his company with pride, not the quiet kind that grows from steady work, but the loud, defensive kind that filled spaces before anyone asked questions. He described expansion plans, partnerships, and growth like they were guaranteed outcomes. But whenever details surfaced, numbers, timelines, actual results, the conversation shifted quickly. I had noticed that months ago. Now, for the first time, I was seeing the full picture laid out calmly in front of me. Later that evening, after Alara had fallen asleep on the couch in my living room, I sat alone with a cup of tea and opened the files that had been shared with us. Public records, nothing intrusive, and just information anyone could access if they knew where to look. The story behind Victor's confidence looked different on paper. delayed payments to suppliers, loans restructured more than once, partnerships that began loudly and ended quietly. His company wasn't collapsing overnight. It had been slowly bending under pressure for a long time. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the pattern. Pride had built a wall around him, and every crack in his business seemed to deepen the resentment he carried into our family. The more pressure he felt professionally, the more he pushed emotionally, trying to prove he wasn't failing by dominating the spaces he could control. My mind drifted back to dinners where he joked about old money and people who inherited everything. At the time, I thought it was insecurity disguised as humor, and now it felt more intentional. A message notification popped onto my screen, this time from Maris. I found something else while looking through old chats. You should see it. A file arrived seconds later. It wasn't financial this time. It was a screenshot of a conversation between Victor and Alara from months earlier. His tone was different, sharper, less guarded than he ever allowed himself to be around me. "Your mom doesn't trust me because she thinks she's better than me," he wrote. "She doesn't understand what it's like to actually fight for success." I felt a small ache in my chest reading it, not because of the insult, but because I recognized the belief behind it. He had built a version of me in his mind that justified his resentment. Another screenshot followed. Or this one showed a message Alara had forwarded to Maris, one of my own texts from nearly a year ago, a simple reminder I had sent late at night after a conversation that didn't sit right with me. "Just be careful, sweetheart. Watch how he handles disappointment." Below it, Victor's reply to Alara stood out clearly. "So your mom's spying on me now? I knew she was trying to turn you against me?" I closed my eyes briefly, letting the realization settle. He had seen my warnings long before the wedding, long before tonight's humiliation. The resentment hadn't appeared suddenly. It had been growing quietly, fed by his belief that I stood between him and the respect he felt he deserved. The officer's earlier words echoed in my mind. Public humiliation can be part of control. I looked toward the living room where Alara slept, curled into herself like someone finally allowed to rest after months of carrying something heavy. The house felt different tonight, quieter but clearer. My phone buzzed again. Victor. I didn't open the message right away. I simply stared at his name on the screen, feeling neither anger nor fear, just understanding. The insult at the wedding wasn't just arrogance, it was a performance built from months of resentment, fueled by a business he could no longer control and a narrative he refused to let go of. I finally opened Maris's last message. "There's one more thing. He didn't just read your texts once. He went through her phone more than you think." My breath slowed, because in that moment I realized Victor hadn't just misunderstood my warnings, that he had been watching them, studying them, long before he stood in front of 250 guests and decided to turn them into a weapon. By morning, the story had already begun to change shape without us. I woke to my phone vibrating nonstop on the bedside table. Missed calls, messages, notifications from people who had been at the wedding and people who had only heard fragments of what happened. I didn't open most of them. Noise had a way of distorting truth, and I wasn't ready to let other people narrate my life before I understood it fully myself. Alara sat at the kitchen counter when I walked in, wrapped in one of my sweaters, staring at a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Her eyes lifted when she heard my footsteps. "His family is saying things online," she said quietly. "That they're telling people you embarrassed him, that you've always tried to control us." I pulled out a chair slowly and sat across from her. "What exactly are they saying?" She hesitated, then turned her phone toward me. Victor's post filled the screen, carefully worded, polished enough to sound calm but sharp enough to shift blame. He didn't mention the insult directly. Instead, he wrote about respect, about people who inherit everything thinking they understand struggle, about how he refused to be judged by someone who had never built anything on her own. I read it once, then again. A faint smile touched my lips. Not amusement, but recognition. For months he had held on to that story about me. The idea that my life had been handed to me, that my success belonged to a man who was no longer here to speak for himself. It had always bothered him more than he admitted. Alara watched my face carefully. He really believes that, doesn't he? Yes, I said simply, because it makes him feel less responsible for his own choices. She leaned back slightly, waiting for me to say more. I rarely spoke about my past in detail, not because I was hiding anything, but because I never wanted my daughter to feel like she had to carry the weight of my struggles. But now, the narrative Victor was pushing forced me to open a door I had kept mostly closed. I didn't inherit my company, I said quietly. When your father passed, all I inherited was uncertainty. The first year after that, I worked out of a borrowed office with a broken chair and a second-hand laptop, so most nights I didn't know if the next contract would come through. Alara's expression softened. Not surprised, but seeing me differently. I built everything step by step, I continued. Mistakes, losses, small wins. No one celebrated. Victor never asked about those parts. He only saw the result. She shook her head slowly. He used to say you didn't understand what pressure felt like. I exhaled gently. Pressure doesn't disappear because someone assumes your life was easy. The room fell into a quiet rhythm. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of cars passing outside. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't thinking about his words as an insult. I was seeing them as a reflection of something he needed to believe. My phone buzzed again, a message from the officer. We've reviewed the materials provided last night. The pattern documented is significant. We'd like to move forward with next steps, only if Alara agrees. I read it slowly, the weight of those words pressing into the space between us. Alara noticed the change in my expression immediately. What is it? I slid the phone across the table toward her. She read the message twice, her fingers tightening around the edges of the device. Fear flickered across her face, but so did something steadier. Resolve, maybe. They think it's serious enough? She asked. Yes, I said gently. She looked down at her hands, silent for a long moment. The woman sitting across from me no longer looked like someone waiting to be rescued. She looked like someone standing at a crossroads, aware that whatever she chose next would shape the rest of her life. I don't want him to keep doing this, she said finally. Not to me, and not to anyone else. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't shake. I nodded slowly, pride rising quietly in my chest. Then we move forward, I said. Outside, sunlight pushed through the curtains, soft but steady, filling the room with a warmth that felt earned rather than given. The truth Victor thought he owned, the version of me he had tried to define publicly, no longer felt heavy. Because for the first time since the wedding, the story wasn't being written by his voice. It was being built by evidence. The knock came early, not loud, not dramatic, just firm enough to carry intention. Alara looked up from the couch, her eyes searching mine before I moved toward the door. I already knew what it meant. The officer had warned us that if Alara chose to proceed, things would move quietly but quickly. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood outside, calm and professional. One of them nodded politely. We wanted to inform you that an arrest has been made this morning. For a moment, the words hung in the air without sound. Alara stepped closer behind me. Victor, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the officer confirmed gently. He has been charged with assault based on the evidence and statements provided. No flashing lights, no raised voices, just a simple sentence that shifted the weight of the entire story. I felt Alara's hand tighten around my arm. Her breath caught, not in relief, not yet, but in the shock of something becoming real. Is he okay?" she asked, surprising even herself. The officer's expression stayed neutral. "He's been processed. The next steps will go through the court." They didn't stay long. A few more instructions about preserving messages, about avoiding direct contact. Then they left as quietly as they arrived, closing the door behind them with a soft click that felt louder than any argument. Alara sank onto the couch, staring at the floor. "I didn't think it would happen this fast," she said. I sat beside her without speaking. The house felt heavier now. Not unsafe, but filled with a new kind of silence, one that came after a line had been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed. My phone buzzed again. A message from someone who had been at the wedding. "Did you hear? His family is saying he's misunderstood." Another message followed, this one from an old acquaintance. "People are talking, but not the way you think." And a lot of guests said, "What he did to you was cruel." I didn't respond. Ilara's phone lit up next. She hesitated before opening it, her shoulders tightening as she read. "His sister just posted something," she said quietly. "She's saying the media twisted everything, but she didn't mention the arrest." I watched her carefully. "How does that make you feel?" She swallowed hard. Confused. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its tires crunching softly against gravel. The ordinary sound felt strange against the magnitude of what had just happened. The same relatives who laughed at the wedding were now silent online. Some had deleted photos from the reception. Others had begun posting vague messages about truth coming out and respecting boundaries. The confidence they carried that night seemed to shrink with every new piece of information that surfaced. Public perception was shifting. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but steadily. Alara leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "I keep thinking about his face when they took him," she said softly. "He probably feels like everything is collapsing." Her voice carried empathy, the same empathy that had kept her silent for too long. "You didn't make his choices," I said gently. She nodded, but her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I started this process," she whispered. "If I hadn't said anything, none of this would be happening." I let her sit with that thought for a moment before responding. "You didn't start anything," I said quietly. "Oh, you ended something." She didn't argue. She just stared at her hands, turning them slowly like she was trying to understand how they could hold both relief and guilt at the same time. A news notification popped up on my phone, a small local blog mentioning a disruption at a wedding reception involving a businessman. No names yet, just speculation. The narrative was already shifting, moving away from the version Victor tried to control. Alara noticed my screen. "People are going to talk about this for a long time, aren't they?" "Maybe," I said, "but people's opinions don't define your healing." She exhaled slowly, leaning back against the couch. For the first time since the arrest, her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Not completely gone, but lighter. Then her expression changed. Fear crept back into her eyes. What if I ruined his life?" she asked quietly. "What if he really was just under pressure and I made everything worse?" The question hung between us, fragile and heavy, and in that moment I realized the hardest part of accountability wasn't the arrest itself. It was helping my daughter understand that choosing safety never meant she had destroyed someone else, even if the world tried to convince her otherwise. The house felt different once the noise outside settled. Not quieter in a heavy way, just calmer. Or the kind of calm that comes when a storm passes and leaves behind space you don't quite know how to fill yet. Alara started therapy a week after the arrest. She didn't announce it like a big decision. One morning she simply said, "I think I need someone who isn't you to talk to." And I nodded without hesitation. That was growth, not distance. For the first time in months, she was choosing support instead of silence. I drove her to the first session but didn't walk her inside. She needed to cross that doorway alone. When she returned to the car afterward, her eyes looked tired but clearer, like someone who had finally spoken sentences she'd been holding back for too long. "It's strange," she said quietly as we drove home. "They didn't tell me what to do. They just listened." I smiled slightly. Sometimes that's the most powerful thing. The days that followed were slower than the chaos of the wedding and arrest. We cooked together more often, moving around the kitchen like we used to when she was younger, passing ingredients back and forth, talking about small things that felt safe. She laughed once while chopping vegetables, and the sound caught me off guard. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I heard her laugh without tension behind it. She began reclaiming pieces of herself gradually: morning walks, calls with friends she had distanced herself from, long moments of quiet where she sat with a notebook, writing thoughts she didn't feel ready to speak out loud. I watched without hovering. Every instinct in me wanted to give speeches, to explain what Victor had done, to tell her she deserved better, to turn the story into a lesson she could carry forever. But healing wasn't built on lectures. It was built on presence. One evening, she sat across from me at the dining table and said, "I don't feel like a victim anymore." I didn't respond right away. I let the words settle between us. "What do you feel like?" I asked gently. She thought for a moment. Someone who made a mistake, but didn't stay trapped in it. Her voice didn't carry shame this time, only honesty. Our bond shifted in those quiet days, less like mother and daughter arguing over decisions, more like two women learning how to trust each other again. She asked me questions about my past, about the years after her father passed, about how I handled loneliness without losing direction. I answered without turning my experiences into warnings. She didn't need fear, and she needed examples of resilience. Outside, the world kept talking. Messages still came from distant relatives and curious acquaintances, but I ignored most of them. I refused to let public opinion shape our healing. One afternoon, Alara glanced at me and said, "You haven't said one angry thing about him." I shrugged lightly. Anger keeps people tied to the past longer than they realize. She studied my face, almost searching for cracks. "Don't you want revenge?" I shook my head slowly. "What I want is peace for you. Everything else is noise." That answer seemed to settle something inside her. The following week, she came home from therapy with a small smile. "I told them about the wedding," she said, "about standing up and walking out with you. They said that was a moment of strength." "It was," I replied, and she leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "I didn't feel strong at the time. I felt tired." "Sometimes strength looks like exhaustion," I said quietly. The days moved forward with gentle consistency until a letter arrived. Plain envelope, official seal. I recognized it before opening it. Alara stood beside me as I slid the paper free. Her breath slowed as she read over my shoulder. Court proceedings had been scheduled. A date, a location, instructions written in calm, procedural language that carried more weight than any emotional conversation we had shared so far. She stepped back slightly, absorbing it. "So it's really happening," she said. "Yes," I answered softly. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear of Victor, but fear of standing in a room where everything would be spoken aloud again. Then I reached for her hand, grounding her without pulling her forward faster than she was ready to move. She squeezed my fingers gently. "I don't want to go back to feeling small," she admitted. "You won't," I said. "You're not the same woman who walked into that wedding." She nodded slowly, eyes steady. And as we set the letter down on the table between us, I realized the next chapter of our story wouldn't be about survival anymore. It would be about standing, fully, publicly, in a truth neither of us needed to hide from again. The courtroom didn't feel as loud as I expected. No shouting, no dramatic outbursts, just quiet movement. Papers sliding across tables, low conversations between attorneys, the soft scrape of chairs against the floor. The kind of silence that carried weight because everyone inside understood the seriousness of what was about to unfold. Alara sat beside me, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't shaking the way she had on the night of the wedding. Therapy had given her something steady to hold on to. Not confidence in perfection, but confidence in truth. Victor sat across the room. For a moment, I barely recognized him. The arrogance he wore so easily at the reception had faded into something tighter, more controlled. His eyes moved through the room quickly, avoiding mine, then returning as if he needed to measure whether I looked angry. I didn't. The proceedings began without spectacle. The prosecutor spoke calmly, outlining a timeline instead of a story. Dates, messages, documented moments that built a picture piece by piece. No exaggeration, no theatrics, just facts. Photos were presented first, not projected dramatically, just handed to the judge and referenced with quiet professionalism. Alara's shoulders stiffened slightly, but she didn't look away. She breathed slowly, grounding herself in the present instead of disappearing into memory. Recordings followed. Victor's voice filled the courtroom briefly, colder than it sounded in the car that night. Without the context of affection or apology, the tone felt sharper. A few heads in the gallery turned subtly, the weight of the words settling into the room without anyone needing to react aloud. Maris testified next. She walked to the stand with a calm that surprised me. Her voice didn't waver as she described how Alara had confided in her, how she had held onto the messages because Alara asked her to, on believing silence was protection. She didn't dramatize anything. She simply spoke, answering questions clearly, her eyes steady on the judge. Across the room, Victor shifted in his seat. At first, he maintained the same posture he wore at the wedding, chin lifted slightly, expression guarded. But as the timeline became clearer, small cracks appeared. His fingers tapped against the table. His gaze dropped when specific messages were read aloud. The defense tried to frame the incidents as misunderstandings, stress, miscommunication, emotional conflict. The words sounded rehearsed, but they didn't carry the same certainty they might have weeks earlier. Alara didn't react outwardly. She sat still, listening, allowing the process to unfold without interruption. I watched her carefully, noticing the way her breathing stayed even. Was the way she held herself like someone who had already faced the hardest part, speaking her truth. When Victor finally spoke, his voice carried less confidence than I expected. He avoided looking directly at me. Instead, he focused on Alara, addressing the room like he was still trying to convince her more than anyone else. "I never meant to hurt her," he said quietly. "Things were complicated. There was pressure, misunderstandings." The words hung in the air, thinner than they might have sounded before the evidence was presented. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his posture. Not fear exactly, but the realization that the narrative he tried to control was no longer his alone. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When the testimonies ended, the courtroom fell into a stillness that felt heavier than any raised voice. "Alara Hale," the judge said gently, addressing her directly. "You've shown significant courage in bringing this forward." Alara nodded once, her expression calm but reflective. The judge continued speaking, outlining the seriousness of patterns revealed through the evidence, not as punishment, but as recognition of harm that could no longer be minimized. The language remained measured, professional, but every word carried weight. I felt Alara's hand slip into mine beneath the table, not out of fear, out of grounding. Victor sat motionless now, the confidence he once wore replaced by something quieter. His family members who attended sat further back than before, their earlier laughter from the wedding feeling like a distant memory. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge paused briefly before speaking again. "Based on what has been presented today," they said, voice steady, "the court recognizes the seriousness of these allegations and the documented pattern involved. The next phase will determine consequences appropriate to the harm demonstrated." The words landed softly, but they changed the air inside the room. Serious consequences. Alara inhaled slowly, her grip tightening around my hand, and as we stood to leave, I realized this wasn't the moment of victory some people imagine. It was the moment when accountability stopped being an idea and started becoming inevitable. The courtroom felt smaller the day the decision came, not physically smaller, just quieter, as if everyone inside understood that this wasn't a moment meant for noise. Nana Alara sat beside me again, her posture steady but heavier than before. Waiting had taken its own kind of strength, and I could feel the weight of it in the way she held my hand. Victor stood when his name was called. He looked different from the man who had raised a glass at the wedding reception. The sharp confidence had softened into something tighter, more guarded. His eyes moved across the room briefly, landing on Alara for a fraction of a second before turning back toward the judge. The words were spoken calmly, without spectacle. A prison sentence, structured, measured, based on the severity and pattern established during the proceedings. No dramatic pause, no raised voices, just a clear acknowledgement that actions carried consequences. Alara's fingers tightened around mine. I didn't look at Victor. I didn't need to. And the moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about the quiet finality of a chapter closing. The courtroom remained still as the details were outlined. Time frames, conditions, next steps, everything delivered with the same professional tone that had carried us through the entire process. It felt strangely gentle, even as the meaning behind it settled heavily in the air. When it was over, people began to stand slowly. Chairs shifted, papers were gathered. A few whispers moved through the gallery, but no one clapped. No one reacted with celebration. This wasn't victory, it was resolution. Alara exhaled a long breath, the kind that seemed to release something she had been holding for months. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I thought I'd feel something louder," she said quietly as we stepped into the hallway. "Well, what do you feel?" I asked. She searched for the words. "Relief," she admitted, and sadness. Not for what happened today, for everything that led here. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Healing didn't erase memory. It just changed the way you carried it. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt softer than it had that morning. A few reporters lingered at a distance, respectful but curious. I guided Alara past them without stopping. There would be time for words later, but not today. We drove home in silence, not the heavy silence of fear or confusion, but a quiet that allowed us to breathe without explanation. Alara leaned her head against the window, watching the city move around us like life had continued uninterrupted while our world shifted beneath the surface. "And I keep thinking about the wedding," she said after a while, "how everything felt so big in that moment. And now it feels so far away." "Moments lose their power when truth catches up to them," I replied gently. She turned toward me, studying my face. "You don't look happy." I smiled softly. "I'm relieved," I said. "There's a difference." She nodded slowly, as if that distinction settled something inside her. When we arrived home, she went upstairs to rest, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the afternoon light stretching across the table. I set my bag down and allowed myself a long breath. Not a sigh of victory, just a quiet acknowledgement that we had reached the end of something difficult. My phone buzzed softly. Messages from acquaintances, from people who had heard pieces of the outcome, some congratulatory, some curious. I didn't open most of them. Instead, I opened a different folder, one I had been working on quietly for weeks. Documents, plans, notes about something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with purpose. The $2 million that never left my account sat waiting for direction. I reviewed the draft statement again, adjusting a few lines, making sure the words carried dignity rather than accusation. This wasn't about Victor. It wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about what came next. Footsteps sounded faintly upstairs as Alara moved around her room, unaware of what I was preparing. I wanted the announcement to come from a place of strength, not reaction. Something that shifted the story away from the wedding and towards something bigger than both of us. I closed my laptop slowly, on the final version saved and ready. Outside, the evening light began to fade, casting soft shadows across the walls. And as I sat there, hands resting calmly on the table, I realized that the most unexpected part of this journey wasn't the insult at the wedding or the outcome in the courtroom. It was what I was about to tell the world next, something no one had seen coming. The announcement wasn't loud, no dramatic music, no staged press conference, just a quiet gathering in a small hall that once hosted community workshops. A space that felt honest enough to hold the truth without turning it into spectacle. I stood behind the podium, hands resting lightly against the edges, watching people take their seats. Some faces were familiar, friends who had supported us quietly through the chaos. Others were strangers, drawn by curiosity after the wedding story traveled farther than I ever expected. Alara sat in the front row. She didn't look nervous. Not exactly, just thoughtful, her eyes steady, her posture stronger than the girl who had once stood at the edge of a reception hall, unsure whether she could walk away. A few reporters set up cameras near the back. Their questions earlier had been predictable. Was this revenge? Was this closure? I had answered none of them. Words spoken too early lose their meaning. When the room settled, I took a slow breath and began. Most people think money is power, I said calmly, but real power is deciding what your money stands for. The words felt simple, but they carried months of thought behind them. I explained how the wedding night had changed more than just my relationship with Victor. It had changed my understanding of what support truly looked like, how silence had allowed patterns to grow unseen, how dignity wasn't about winning arguments, but about creating spaces where others could stand safely. I didn't mention Victor's name. He no longer needed to be the center of the story. Instead, I spoke about the $2 million I had planned to give him, the investment that never happened. A few heads in the room lifted when I said the amount aloud, whispers moving softly through the crowd. That money was meant to rebuild a business, I continued. But after everything that came to light, I realized it could build something stronger. A screen behind me lit up with the name of the foundation, and a quiet initiative focused on supporting survivors of abuse, not just emotional or physical harm, but financial coercion, legal guidance, counseling resources, emergency grants that allowed people to leave unsafe situations without feeling trapped by money. The shift in the room was immediate. Curiosity softened into respect. The narrative began changing right there in real time, from scandal to purpose. This isn't about charity, I said gently. It's about restoring dignity, about making sure no one stays silent because they feel alone or dependent. I paused, letting the words settle. The cameras clicked softly, but I didn't look toward them. My focus stayed on Alara, whose eyes shimmered with something deeper than pride. Understanding, maybe. Recognition of how far she had come. Questions followed. A reporter asked if the foundation was my way of responding to the wedding humiliation. I shook my head lightly. It's my way of responding to truth, I said. Pain only holds power when it remains personal. When it becomes purpose, it begins to heal more than one life. The room grew quiet again. People weren't leaning forward for drama anymore. They were listening. When I finished speaking, applause came slowly, respectfully, not loud enough to feel like celebration, but strong enough to carry warmth. Outside the hall, the air felt lighter. Messages began appearing on my phone almost immediately. Not gossip this time, but support. People sharing their own stories quietly, thanking me for creating something that felt safe enough to exist. Alara walked toward me, her steps measured but confident. She wrapped her arms around me briefly, and a gesture that felt different from the one outside the wedding hall. This wasn't rescue, it was partnership. "You turned something ugly into something good," she said softly. I smiled. "We did," I corrected. She looked back toward the reporters gathering near the entrance, their microphones waiting, their expressions curious but softer than before. "They asked if I would say a few words," she admitted quietly. My chest warmed at the thought. Weeks ago, she would have avoided any spotlight completely. Now she stood there considering it, not from pressure, but from choice. "You don't have to," I said gently. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." Her voice carried a steadiness that made my eyes sting slightly. The doors opened again, and a small group of journalists stepped closer, ready for the next voice in the story. For the first time since the wedding, Alara didn't look like someone hiding from attention. She looked like someone stepping into it on her own terms. She took a slow breath, turned toward the waiting microphones, and began to walk forward. And in that moment, I realized the greatest transformation wasn't the foundation I had just announced. It was watching my daughter find the strength to speak for herself, for the very first time. The room felt different now. Not because it was fuller or louder, but because the energy had shifted from curiosity to purpose. People moved through the foundation space with quiet conversations, soft smiles, and the kind of respect that comes when a story grows beyond the people who lived it. Alara stood beside me near the front of the hall, and greeting guests who came to learn more about what we had built together. She spoke with ease, not rehearsed, not guarded, just honest. Watching her felt like witnessing a new chapter unfold in real time. The same woman who once sat silently at the edge of a wedding reception now stood confidently, explaining how resources could help others leave situations that felt impossible to escape. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't hover. I simply stood close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. A woman approached us quietly, eyes warm but hesitant. She thanked Alara for speaking earlier, her voice trembling as she shared pieces of her own experience. Alara listened carefully, nodding gently, offering comfort without trying to fix what couldn't be solved in a single conversation. When the woman walked away, Alara turned toward me with a small smile. "I never imagined I'd be here," she said. "Neither did I admitted softly. The foundation launch wasn't grand or dramatic. No spotlight, no music swelling to create emotion, just people gathering, sharing, learning. That simplicity felt right. After everything that had happened, I didn't want noise. I wanted meaning. As the afternoon faded into evening, I stepped away from the crowd briefly, standing near the window where sunlight filtered softly through the glass. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the wedding, the insult, the laughter, the silence that followed. Back then, some people thought my stillness meant defeat. They didn't understand that silence can be a choice. I hadn't stayed quiet because I felt small. I stayed quiet because reacting in anger would have given Victor exactly what he wanted: chaos, attention, control over the narrative. By refusing to fight in that moment, I had created space for something stronger to grow. Alara joined me at the window, slipping her hand into mine the way she did when she was a child. "Do you ever wish you said something back that night?" she asked. I thought about it for a second. No, I said honestly. Words spoken in anger rarely build anything worth keeping. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the people gathered across the room. You were strong even when it looked like you weren't. I smiled slightly. Strength isn't always loud. The doors opened, letting in a soft breeze that carried laughter from outside. The foundation sign near the entrance caught the fading light, and its name reflecting back at us like a promise fulfilled. There was no need for revenge speeches, no need to prove anything to anyone. The story had already shifted from humiliation to healing, from private pain to public purpose. Ilara leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. I'm proud of you too, I replied. We stood there together, watching people connect, watching conversations unfold that had nothing to do with Victor anymore. His presence in our lives had faded into something distant. Not erased, but no longer defining the path ahead. The foundation wasn't just a response to what happened at the wedding. It was a reminder that dignity could grow from even the most uncomfortable moments, shaping something meaningful instead of destructive. As the evening settled around us, I felt a deep calm fill my chest. Not triumph, not relief alone, but clarity. The silence I chose that day had been misunderstood by many, but now its purpose felt undeniable. I turned toward Ilara, squeezing her hand gently. I didn't lose anything that day, I said softly. I just stopped funding the man who thought my kindness made me small.